Excuse me. So in 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt is elected President of the United States. And we're in the midst of a depression. We're in the midst, later on, of World War II. And the federal government, especially as the depression was hitting, and then again as the country sort of shifted over into becoming essentially a war-making machine, the federal government got more and more involved. But when it came to dealing with the Depression in particular, Franklin Roosevelt's approach was to go ahead and try and create agencies within the federal government to address specific kinds of problems. So, for example, there was something called the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And what this was the federal government was going to hire a bunch of people just so that they could have work to go ahead and start cleaning up parks and highways and things like that. So he asked Congress, hey Congress, I want to create this thing called the Civilian Conservation Corps. And this is what we're going to do. This is how much money I need. Congress says, oh, okay, sure, Mr. President. So they pass a law creating it, and they allocated a certain amount of money, and boom, the president is in charge of it. They passed all kinds of other legislation, a great deal of which is still around. The National Labor Relations Board was created around this time that dealt with labor disputes. I believe the Securities and Exchange Commission that controls trading on Wall Street was created around this time. They created all kinds of different agencies to deal with some of the problems. Well, the reality is that when you give somebody more responsibility, you also give them more power. If someone is responsible for making sure the food supply is safe, making sure that people are employed, making sure that trading on the stock market is done fairly, if they're responsible for all kinds of things, well, you're giving them power at the same time. So it's important to think about the growth of presidential power. Who gave presidents more responsibilities? Well, Congress did. The president requested more power, more responsibilities, and the Congress gave it to him. So who gave presidents more power? Well, Congress did. And that's something we forget about, or that isn't discussed about very often. The power of the presidency grew a great deal, but part of the reason that it grew is because Congress essentially gave the president more and more responsibility. When the Constitution was first adopted, one of the things that the framers were really worried about was that presidents would try and take power from Congress. They used the word encroach, that presidents would try and encroach on the power of Congress. When you encroach on something, like you get into their space. And they were afraid that presidents would encroach on the powers of Congress, try and take the powers of Congress away. So they built into our political system the ability of Congress to be able to check the president, to be able to keep the president away and to stop him from doing that. But what the framers didn't plan for was the idea that Congress was going to go, oh, here, Mr. President, here's some more power and responsibility. Oh, here's some more, here's some more, here's some more, and dumping more and more responsibility and power onto Congress. So part of the reason that presidents have become more powerful, part of it is just sort of the way the world has changed and the federal government needing to be more involved. And if the federal government's more involved because the president sits on top of the federal government, he's going to have more power. Part of that power came from Congress going, here you go. So power kept growing and growing and growing. And by the 1970s, when Richard Nixon took office, there was a book written about him called The Imperial Presidency. It was called The Imperial Presidency, where the suggestion was that Richard Nixon thought he was a king, that he basically thought that he could go ahead and do anything as president. For example, and this isn't going to be on the exam, but at one point, President Nixon and people in his administration started to push forward on something called the Huston Plan. It's actually spelled H-U-S-T-O-N, the Huston Plan. And the way that this plan was going to work is that there were people who were opposing the Nixon administration's policies, like on Vietnam, people who were protesting and working against the administration. So what this plan did, these people were going to do, is they were going to use the FBI and the CIA to spy on the president's political opponents. Now keep in mind, these are not people who are breaking the law. These are people who are exercising their First Amendment rights. These are people who are following the law. The president was going to go ahead and use the FBI and the CIA to spy on his political opponents. Now, if that didn't scare, the whole thought of that doesn't scare the hell out of you, you need to rewind this thing and play it over again. Just imagine if we have a president, just imagine if President Obama decided to use the CIA and the FBI to spy on people who disagreed with him. That's not what we do. This is America. We don't do that stuff. That's a Soviet Union. That's North Korea. We don't do that. So, as power of the president continued to grow, Congress finally started to push back. And I'm going to talk about two instances. First, an instance where Congress tried to push back on the growth of presidential power, and it didn't work. It didn't stop the president from doing what he wanted to do. In the second case, it was an example of when the Congress did push back and was successful. So the first one is a case where Congress pushes back and they're unsuccessful. That was the passage of what's called the War Powers Act. The War Powers Act was actually passed in, I think, 1973. It actually passed Congress, the president vetoed it, and then Congress overrode the veto. So 2/3, both the House and the Senate, overrode the veto. And this is what the War Powers Act says. And I want to point out that it is law today. This is still law today. The War Powers Act requires the president to notify Congress. If the president sends troops into harm's way, the president has to notify Congress within 48 hours of sending troops into harm's way. Now, the president also, according to the law, must withdraw those troops within 60 days unless one of three things happens. One, if Congress declares war, or if they provide financial support, if they authorize the war, if they say, here's money for the war, by the way, then the troops can stay. But if the Congress goes ahead before that 60 days is up and they say, okay, here you go, you got another 60 days to keep them out there, they can stay out there. Or if for some reason Congress is unable to meet, if a nuclear weapon hits Washington, D.C. and Congress is decimated, or they scatter or whatever, they can't meet. But unless one of those three things happens, unless Congress declares war or otherwise authorizes the war by providing financial support, unless they extend the 60-day period, or unless they can't meet, the president is required to pull the troops back home within 60 days. Well, here's the thing. Presidents from both parties, Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, presidents from both parties have claimed that the War Powers Act is unconstitutional, and they have refused to follow it. Now, let me change that just a little bit. It's not that they've refused to follow it. Sometimes they go ahead and they follow the provisions, but they always make a point of saying, we are following these provisions voluntarily. Like, I don't have to do this stuff. I don't have to notify you, because bottom line is, I'm the commander-in-chief and I can command the troops anywhere I want. But they've so far followed it. But there are times when the presidents have exercised their power, basically in defiance of Congress. Just recently, President Obama sent troops into Libya. And for 2 days, 48 hours, for 2 days, the United States Armed Forces bombed the crap out of Libya and the stronghold of Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan dictator. Then, after 2 days, what they did is they pulled out of the area and they stationed themselves in the Mediterranean Sea. They were no longer actively bombing, right? But now instead what they were doing is they were directing other nations to bombing. We were using our radar and things like that to tell other people where they should be dropping their bombs. Now Congress said, hey, look, we didn't authorize this, so after 60 days you're going to have to pull back troops. What the president said was, no, the War Powers Act says I only have to do that if troops are in harm's way, if troops are actually in hostilities. Well, we're off the coast of Libya, and nobody's bombing us because they can't bomb us because we're too far away and they don't have an air force. So therefore, the War Powers Act, this has nothing to do with what I'm doing. Now, it was clearly Congress's intent when they passed the War Powers Act to try and take back the war-making power. And the president said, in this case, Tough. Now, other presidents have done the same thing. All presidents, every president, since the passage of the War Powers Act, has said it's unconstitutional and they don't have to follow it. That Congress cannot limit the powers of the commander-in-chief that are granted to the president in Article 2. Okay? Now, actually, Congress could do one thing if they wanted. If a president did that, they could do something, like Congress could have done something this time. In theory, at least, they could have impeached the president and tried to convict him and try and throw him out of office. Congress doesn't do that. They haven't done it, and I don't think it's reasonable to think they're going to do it in the future. This was an attempt on the part of Congress to push back, and it failed. Now next, in Presidency 05, I'm going to talk about an example where Congress goes ahead and pushes back against the president, but this time they succeed. And that will come up next.